All righty then. We'll get started. Get into the meat of the second half of the presentation. So, we're talking about the study, and we want to make sure that you know what's underlying the whole thing, why you guys are here, why you're coming out to these things, why you've been invited, is because you're all been involved in some way in doing microgrids in communities. Started a couple of years ago. NJIT and NJDPU started a process of going to the U.S. Department of Energy and applying for a state energy program grant. That came through about a year and a half ago. We have all kinds of bureaucracy challenges along the way, but we basically started now this project called Financing Advanced Microgrids, which is a study which has its roots in New Jersey and dealing with the opportunities New Jersey has for building advanced or community microgrids, but looking from a national perspective as well. I wound up being the principal investigator, as we call it in academic terms, and the subject matter expert, such as I may be, for this project. We have about a year from now to complete it. The project will involve completion of a number of different outcomes. Some may be PowerPoint, some will be written reports, some will be webinars, some will be website resources. There's a whole bunch of things that will come out of this. But the hard part is kind of figure out how you do community microgrids while the community microgrid world is evolving at a very fast clip, as we discussed here today. So that's the challenge we have. Tara told you a little bit before about the goals and the objectives of the project, which I think were pretty clear. I'm going to go into what we're going to look at along the way. And what we really need from you guys, and you'll be able to do this a couple ways, is your feedback on whether what I'm going to be talking about makes sense of things for study, things you think we should be added to it, things you should be subtracted from it, think should be subtracted from it, or some different approach. You can discuss that here. We're going to spend here hopefully until about 2 o'clock on this. But you all have does anybody not have one of the slide deck handouts? Everybody's got slide deck handouts, okay. Can we get one from Mr. Sullivan? Then, Dick, we got a couple more over there. Mr. Sullivan always manages to get through. Ben and Joe. Anybody else need one? So there's room on there. You can write on that thing. You can take it back with you and send me an email. If you just want to write your notes on it, if they're modestly legible, leave it with me and I can incorporate that in. But we are looking for feedback on how the study is going to proceed. I will tell you, I'd like to say that the study is really starting in the next week or two, but some of you know I'm going to be away for like 4 weeks in February and into March. And I'm going to be down under, as they say, on a long planned vacation to celebrate turning 65 and making it that far. So come March, April, this is going to kick off and it's going to be my primary preoccupation roughly for the next year. So this is going to be something, so those of you will be hearing from me, you'll be seeing me. We'll be doing more stakeholder meetings where we'll be doing some different events as well.
And Mark, the study is for the DOE? Yes,
the study is for US DOE. It's part of their state energy grant program. And that's who, or the client is, it's, you know, BPU got it, they've subcontracted it out to Blaustein and JIT. We are working together on that, as you have noticed, as a project team. And that's where we're going with this. That's challenge 10.
Do you want to mention
sure.
The website that's on the...
Yes, so actually I did have that as a link in here at one point, but I think it got lost along the way. We'll show you a web, it's no. Oh, right. Oh, geez, I completely forgot about that. Yes, if you have a device, do we have that on the program?
Yeah.
On the program. If you look at your program, read the program at the top, it talks about you can text messages to a website and we will see the comments. And I'm going to give you one on that top. Completely forgot about that. That you can actually make comments while I'm talking. Now, I know that's dangerous, particularly with Sullivan and Chuck and Adam if they come back. But Tara's going to see them, not me.
Haha.
So we will, I completely forgot about that. Yeah, no, it's not good. No.
So feel free to ask all the anonymous questions
Yes.
you have of Mark.
Turn it on momentarily.
Like, what did you have for dinner last
All right, somebody want to send something? So anybody sign up for that? If you have, just send like a text, the thing that says text or something. Right? Okay. So actually, no, not you.
I'll send
No.
the test.
Send a test. I will see it as we go. Cool. All right. Good, we covered that. All right. So I want to do a couple terms first because these are common terms that we're using in project. One is, what's a SOPO? Tara mentioned this before. Anybody know what a SOPO is? Gail. Okay. Gail would know that.
I guess I feel like I'm cheating.
Yes, go ahead, Gail. That's right.
I think it's statement of project
Objectives.
objectives.
Right. This is what we call, it's a document that we have with US DOE, because here's what this study is going to entail. That was done roughly about a year and a half ago. As we mentioned, microgrids seem to be evolving at a very quick pace, and we have the ability to change it along the way. So getting some feedback from you based on what you're going to hear today, which is based on the current SOPO, will help us with that process. We may have missed some things. We may have some things that are irrelevant. That's the feedback that we are looking from you. We're also using the term AMG, Advanced Microgrid, because that is the term that is in our grant contract agreement type thing. So you'll see the AMG abbreviation through here. That's all the types of microgrids that we are talking about here. A benchmark. Since we can't survey the entire United States, we're going to use some benchmark states and communities that we're going to be studying to look at this. So the folks involved in the BPU's project, your benchmark community. The folks in Connecticut, we're probably going to choose some of those to look at from a benchmark standpoint. New York State has a program. The NY CERTA has called the NY Prize program. We're going to look at that. California's got a program. Maryland's got a program. We're looking further. We're also identifying communities that already have things done in other places. So we're looking at those. We have a wonderful intern working for us, Eli, who's back in the back room there. He's kind of inventorying those things for us to try to reduce that down. So if you have any other ideas of places or places you think we should use as benchmarks, let us know.
Yeah, Rhode Island might also be one of these talked to. They're probably about the same stage as you right now, but they're looking at a partnership between the infrastructure bank, the renewable energy fund, and the energy office, and the local microgrid finance program.
Good.
We're trying to launch it this year, but I think that's a little
Okay.
ambitious, so 2021.
We'll have a chat with them, okay? We'll find people there.
Also, I think Puerto Rico is moving.
Yeah, they've got all
despite
kinds of
their
stuff.
problems.
The budget, I wish the budget had travel money for that.
Yeah. Well, you don't want to go there now.
Right, yeah, like the earthquake.
Tremors,
You got an earthquake thing going on.
But anyway,
But
the point
yeah,
is,
Puerto
they've
Rico,
got
okay.
some pretty
Yeah.
strong, policy changes in place
Yeah.
for microgrids.
Yeah, they also, the PUC rules, I think they made those changes in regards to microgrids. So
Okay.
you want to talk to
That's good.
those.
Okay, so it's Puerto Rico and BP. Okay, any other quick ones? We'll have another shot at that in a couple minutes. All right. And P&F is just an abbreviation we have for procuring and financing, because the study financing advanced microgrids involves procuring and financing. That's sort of the bucket, the bracketing we're looking at when it comes to microgrids, but we're going to ask some other questions about that as well. So with that, let's get into the underlying research. So The startup efforts that we're either have done or are underway are starting to identify the potential benchmark states and cities agencies that are involved in AMG activities. Some of our resources include National Association of Regulated Utility Type People, NASIO, so that was really good timing there.
Actually, I have one more suggestion.
Yes.
For you before people, check with Massachusetts as well if you haven't talked to Massachusetts. MassCC does a community microgrids program as well, and they're kind of doing feasibility studies.
Yep, there are 6 states that we know of. It's California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, New York, New Jersey. Those are the kind of the big 6 that we've identified so far. NJIT has been doing some work on that, and we know these programs. Washington D.C., New Britain, Connecticut, Alexandria, those are some of the folks that have popped up so far. All right, so into the project planning side, how do benchmark projects develop or will develop? We have this issue of how did those places get to the point of when they are proceeding with a specific project? Did they engage in some kind of a planning process? We're thinking we need to know at what point did financing issues and decisions become clear? Did that happen before or after there was a detailed design and technical feasibility? Right? Where do these things come together? We think we want to inventory the identified purposes of those benchmark AMGs, and some of those things could include things like environmental resilience, emergency service resilience, an economic alternative to the grid, an economic development incentive program. What motivated these microgrids? What was the thing in that place that said, hey, this is the thing that we want to look at and that we're trying to do? Or alternatively, did somebody show up at their door and say, hey, I'm this business in town, I'm this hospital, all right, I'm this naval weapons station, all right, and there's something we can want to work with the local government. And one of the questions that goes along with that is, should there be a planning process that looks at what alternatives might be, right? Instead, the notion of, and we'll come back to this, but somebody comes in and says, okay, here's a good idea, here's what will work in my community, right? Well, does the town just start with that, or do they step back and say, okay, let's take a bigger picture view of this? Maybe instead of just going down this corridor, maybe we want to look at another corridor too. Or are there some other organizations that might want to tap into this because there's going to be value there? So looking at alternatives along the way.
It might just be semantic, but I think the idea of economic alternative to the grid sort of hardens the battle lines between the utility and wouldn't there also be economic advantages of services to the grid that we want to look at? Right now that can't happen because ownership and right of way and all these things, but economic alternative to the grid implies abandoned load and lost revenues to the utility.
Which is a problem, yeah.
I think we should think about either adding another bullet, the economic opportunity for coexisting and servicing.
I like that. Okay.
As opposed to just alternative.
That's good. That works. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Don't forget to, if you repeat questions, Greg will be able to hear them.
Oh, okay. All right. So Greg, I'll pick you up on the next one, assuming that Greg is still there. Greg, by the way, is our program rep from U.S. Department of Energy. He's been available. He's been on here for or off and on all day. All right. And finally, identify common practices and successful cases. Those are the basic things that we want to be able to do. Procuring and financing authority to engage in an AMG. This stems from our Jersey experience because New Jersey is not quite a perfect home rule state as some people say it is. And there's a whole lot of state government laws and regulations that deal with how municipalities or school boards or counties and local authorities can do things. So some of the questions we want to understand here in Jersey, which we've got a pretty good handle on, but other places understand the range of ownership, contracting authority, and process requirements that guide benchmark AMG activities. And that would include, but not being limited to, the scope or range of microgrid projects that are available to them, ownership models and linkages to financing models and linkages to ownership, Procurement practices, including regulations and practices concerning selection of contractors and professional services for all phases, feasibility, design, financing, construction, and commissioning. Those are the interesting challenges. Understand how benchmarks address legal authority, procurement, financing, and identify those practices and challenges to doing so. We expect to look at those 6 states those other 5 states that I mentioned, and any other ones that pop up, to see what that environment is for government action. It may not be a lot in some of those places, but being here in Jersey, we have to be able to address that.
I was just kind of going on the point earlier, what Ed said, in this list or page before, what are the kind of regulatory rules of the road for, for the state in terms of, regulatory ability to build an advanced microgrid?
Yes, that's.
I mean, honestly, that's kind of the big issue.
That's the underlying point. That's the question.
But it's not. There's no point saying that discreetly.
Not overt. Okay, you're right. Okay, good point.
Just a clarifying question. I guess it could fall under procurement practices.
We're gonna, by the way, we're gonna get into a deeper dive of these.
Okay.
Of each of these.
Yeah,
This is kind of an
but
overview.
my only thought is, should the word compliance and standards be under that? Is that part of, the commission?
Yes,
or,
I think compliance makes sense,
rather
yes.
than pointing it specifically that standards-based, microgrids is an important part. We just want to let that fall under procurement practices. I mean, IEEE
yeah.
1547.
That's going to come up. Those standards are going to come. Yes, that's going to pop up later. Yeah, that's going to.
Okay.
That will pop up later.
Good.
All right. So that's the preliminary stuff. That's the first thing we're going to be working on as we go on. Once that's done, we're going to move forward to task and subtask research. The way the SOPO is established is that there's tasks, big task, which is then divided into subtasks. And the way we wind up responding to DOE is framing our work in basis of those subtasks. So we're going to kind of go through what some of those subtasks are. You will see that I've got quotate there actually quoted in the presentation to give you a sense of what the specific thing is. If you think that maybe we ought to modify some of those stuff, we can certainly take a crack at that too. So if you see some other ideas that ought to come in, we can deal with that. The big picture of the full task, an outline of fundamental guidelines for ownership and sources of financing for planning, design, construction, and operations of the advanced microgrid. Overarching issues that we're going to look at in all issues, the purposes and benefits that motivate the microgrid, be it general resilience, environmental benefits, cost savings, economic development, and the impacts, including the impact on the distribution, utility, and social equity. There will be others that pop up. Those were just some that we put down to start this off. Risk assessment and mitigation strategies. We think that becomes a very important element of this because we've got government agencies going into businesses they've never been in before, and they really need to be able to look and understand the risks and develop strategies to mitigate risk or to absorb the risk or to lay it off on somebody else. Those become important things to address. And the impact of how inherent integration of ownership, procurement, and financing affects the process. We know we have extremes where a government agency could be the sole owner and engage in financing to develop and operate it. The other extreme, we have buying energy as a service, where there's just somebody else takes full responsibility for developing the project, and the government agency or the users on it are just paying for whatever power supply they actually need. So that's the bigger thing. It breaks down first into ownership, where it's identifying and evaluate various ownership and governance models that can accommodate the stakeholders in the advanced microgrid. Those models include traditional government ownership and various combinations of government, private sector, hybrid, and energies as a service arrangements. And some of the research elements of that include identify the role of all key participants, owners, off-takers, suppliers, contractors, public, how selection of the partner is done, how ownership and management decisions get made, dispute resolution, legal basis for doing the project, tax and public finance issues, risk and reward allocation, upgrade and replacement policies and decision-making, and stakeholder and public responses and engagement. these are things that we have to touch on. They're all part of what a government agency needs to think about, and hopefully does think about along the way. Those are the things on ownership and that relationship that the government agency is going to have, and it's going to vary based on the type of project. If energy is a service, there's no risk to the government agency, but the risk taker is somewhere else, and there's a compensation involved for that as well, and they got to pay for that. So that's all the things that pop up there. Financing, range of options for that. Evaluate public and private financing options for developing and operating advanced microgrids and the impact on different stakeholders. Example, public entities, institutions, private entities. And the range of public and private financing options include, but are not limited to, and this is just a first pass at this. Grants could include clean energy funding, FEMA hazard mitigation grants, HUD housing, resiliency grants, and state programs like NYSERDA, the green banks that we're hearing about. Funding coming from savings, which could be from energy efficiency programs, energy savings programs like in New Jersey, we've ESIPs and ESCOs. Should they be included to include advanced microgrids? Government loans and loan guarantees, infrastructure banks, federal programs, FEMA and HUD. That's one side of it. Another side, debt-based models, general obligations, debt, and green bonds. I haven't heard anybody talk about yet where the government agency would issue green bonds. Is that something on anybody's radar? Because it's really starting to be talked about in public finance sectors these days. Ben, you?
I took it out of my presentation.
Oh, okay, but it's a thing.
It's a thing.
Okay, because I was wondering about that, or public finance things I follow talk about that.
Was that used in Mississippi? It wasn't. We explored it with the state.
What about PACE loans? I think Connecticut mentioned.
Yeah. I think
Is that a real thing?
if you're looking, I think in the energy, if you're looking from the energy efficiency side, that's where PACE loans come from. But I think that's a good point. We should add that into it.
Especially if it's linked with
AMPs
with energy.
In New Jersey, we have a nascent PACE program that's slowly starting along the way. Oh, okay. Oh, we've heard from Greg. Thank you, Greg. So yeah, so Greg from Washington notes that folks may be interested to know that DOE has a lot of active research on microgrids, so we are here for technical assistance. This includes tapping into best practices from our national lab efforts. Greg will be dropping off and we'll catch up again. So thank you, Greg, for listening in on all this. So that's our debt models: private financing, private equity debt, and project revenue. Energy as a service models, fees for energy versus power via power purchase agreements, and hybrid, some combination of the foregoing. Anything glaringly outstanding, missing, like the PACE approach? Yeah.
What about the use of opportunity zones?
Oh, yeah.
With strategic economic development areas?
Yep.
We
Opportunity zone's a good one. We've got a bunch of them here in New Jersey. That's another point. Yeah.
I think I know it's kind of embodied here, but certainly leveraging, other ECMs to help finance this. So there are, lighting.
Right. So when we under energy efficiency, I think that.
So to make that, apart from, so funding from, and I sort of draw that out a little bit, because when we often look at that is, here's a discrete stream of funding, what can we do with this? We can replace the roof, or
right.
Maybe we can buy a piece of micro.
So, and it may be that there's a combination of these things. So there may be opportunities where if we're going to do a microgrid, but we want to do savings, okay, so maybe you build in an ESCO type project along with that. One of the things we haven't done, and I've thought about it a little bit, is there any merit or significant risk in adding to the New Jersey flavor of ESCO and energy performance programs, notions of resiliency? Now, it doesn't save money, but resiliency has value. It goes back to what we talked about earlier is how do you, I think Isabel was talking about is the challenge of valuing resiliency, which is an interesting amorphous thing that people want to try to grab onto. There's been a number of academic studies on it, but there doesn't seem to be any real serious model on how to do that and figure out how to monetize that in some way.
So there is precedent with the Department of Environmental Protection, which backstops every rule it promulgates with a cost-benefit analysis based on, you know, so it's $55 a day per person to fund wastewater treatment plants. So basically, if you didn't have a wastewater treatment plant, the degradation of the environment has a value of 35 or 55, I believe it's $55 per person served per year. It's an enormous amount of money, which means you can spend $1 billion on a wastewater treatment plant.
Right.
So we've had this discussion a number of times with various entities in the States. It got dropped because it's a very difficult discussion to have. But I think it would be a mistake to kind of say there is no precedent. I think it's extraordinarily important. I mean, that's a game changer.
Yeah.
To follow up on that, what you were saying a little bit earlier, I'm not sure I interpreted it right. Are you saying that on the energy efficiency side, we should include doing things to reduce load in the participants in the microgrids and taking advantage of clean energy to do that? Or were you saying, but I also heard, that should we be exploring the potential for there being a clean energy program incentive to buy into a microgrid?
No, the former. But I want to kind of separate it out as more of a discrete thing. I think the message is a little bit we heard before. If there's an energy efficiency project, hold on, you know, and you have a microgrid thought in your head. You know, so yes, it's obvious that while we're doing a microgrid, we can grab some energy efficiency. I want to make a bigger statement, say, if you're doing energy efficiency,
You consider that among the mix. But the savings from an energy efficiency program can get plugged into what you get out of the microgrid.
I would, maybe it's a semantic difference, but I would even go the next step and say, these are programs to be microgrid ready. First, you go in and do the most energy efficiency, same as if you're doing solar. You go in and tighten the envelope first, then you size the solar based on that. And the second part is, let's not forget demand response for capability of leveling that load to meet your microgrid supply so it doesn't have to be oversized. So I think energy efficiency and demand response make you microgrid ready. And those are programs you should promote to
I wouldn't go too far down that track because I think you're painting yourself into a corner. We all understand with a microgrid, I want to have the freedom to sort of look at what I have, I'll optimize around what I'm dealing with. I think we all want to say yes, make your buildings efficient, reduce particularly those nasty peaks, take that out of your system or whatever. That saves money. That's part of what I would consider energy efficiency. I don't want to be in a position where my microgrid is saying, you know, in order for me to get this grant, I need to reduce my buildings by.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing. I'm totally not arguing that. That would be too constraining. But yes, the point being, energy efficiency and demand response are a precursor, not necessary, but they're important.
Well, but I mean, it's sort of like I can see what Broad's saying, because I think what you're saying, if I hear you correctly, Broad, is it's sort of like the pay for performance kind of thing. You know, you lump a bunch of projects together, and the portfolio of those projects become easier to finance than just going with a microgrid by itself. So if you have control projects and lighting and everything else, you lump them in with the microgrid, and you go out to the market to finance it. It becomes easier to finance.
That's better.
One of the things that's starting to show up, and Ben talked about this, and I think it was clear in what Isabel was talking about, is that each of these things are different. Each microgrid opportunity brings its own portfolio of different elements, and part of this effort, I think, is defining what those elements are, because that's the package that you can develop, and that's where you're going to go look for different financing opportunities to see what mix of financing opportunities are going to work for this particular project. I'm finding that a really interesting and challenging notion when you're trying to say something, here's the list of things you can do. It's likely that may exist for a couple of years until things settle out and people understand it all better. And that way you might start to get some consistency. Like we're starting to see some manufacturers develop the notion of package plants when it comes to a microgrid, a package of stuff that they can bring in and set up someplace. We're seeing that from the California wildfires, for example, where vendors are packaging things and boom, drop them in, hook them up and moving on. That may happen over time, but we got a ways to go on that.
Mark, a couple other things you should consider is that currently the use of societal benefits charge funds, which is a source of funding for
Good one,
this,
yeah.
becomes an issue because SBC, as defined by ADECA, says it has to be energy savings. So by definition, can't be used for resiliency. So there are some things that we have within our current structures that need to be tweaked or modified to accommodate this. And then the other piece that goes into this formulation, as you look at it, is that we're now back into RGGI, and so are a lot of other states. And we expect at some point that may expand.
Yep.
So there's a value of carbon, not renewable, but carbon itself, that can become part of the financial modeling for the microgrid.
Yep. No, I think that's a really good point. SBC needs to be on there, and the uncertainty of what RGGI is going to be for us, for New Jersey, but we also have our partner states where we can see where RGGI is having an effect there as well.
I think the whole issue of carbon valuation, it's specific to us as RGGI, but nationally, if you're looking at this, it becomes a big issue.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Financing, on the financing side, we want to look at financial feasibility analysis, and we've talked about that. Ben did a demo on that, but it's the idea of the development of data needed by the financiers to make decisions that the government agencies got to be able to come up with, or whoever is on their development team to do that. We want to look at programs that are hybrids, that are a mix of public and private financing. I'm beginning to suspect that there's going to be just a spectrum of different models for this, of different elements that come up along the way, and that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. How is the financial feasibility conducted? Development and analysis of options, and the role and process of pro forma calculations and their review. I may come from this with a little bit of inherent bias that I'm very conscious of, where I look at pro forma type things from a municipal development standpoint, housing development and tax exemptions, to see how developers are working their numbers to say, well, I need a tax exemption for this project, otherwise I can't do it. And frankly, there's some skepticism developing on those types of things. And I am conscious that I bring that little baggage to this, but we need to kind of see how this plays out in this world, because where is the risk allocation? And we'll talk a little bit about the phrase asymmetry of risk and asymmetry of knowledge on these types of projects. And government agencies need to be sort of acutely aware of the challenges for that. And finally, identifying risks related to financing and mitigation strategies. What are those risks that we have to deal with, and what are the tactics we have to manage those things? We haven't talked a lot about that so far in these discussions, and I'm looking forward to getting to the weeds with some of you on how that works. Well, here's my information risk. Managing information risk. Properly managing the risk stemming from the inherently greater knowledge that the developer has about the activity. Symmetry of information. This is a theory in the world of public procurement, where I sort of come from, is that when you're dealing with complex project, be it a construction project, be it could even be in ESIP/ESCO type of deal. The engineering people, the developers who are doing this know more about the project than the owner. They are inherently smarter than the owner, and the owner has responsibilities. I would argue has a responsibility to hire smart people to help them understand what it is they're looking at, and are they seeing the entire picture. There's some concern from the public standpoint on that, to make sure that we're properly doing our diligence on these projects. And that's can be challenging to do. Can be reflected in negotiated terms, that unknown to the public agency could favor developers and investors over the agency. I know that sounds harsher when I read it out loud than when I wrote it last night. And so don't take that the wrong way, but it's just looking to balance out that information challenge. Right, and it's not that it's developer versus municipality, it's how they work together to make sure those risks are properly understood and balanced. The risk can be managed by equalizing knowledge and creating a symmetrical knowledge balance. This can also involve considerations of outsourcing the risks of an advanced microgrid to private owners or operators versus taking on the government taking an ownership and management responsibility. In some cases, it just may be better for the government to enter into an energy as a service agreement. But even when you go there, you have the challenges, okay, what is the rate setting apparatus there? How do we resolve that when that changes over time?
This is the age-old problem in almost every governmental act. The government doesn't belong in private sector business, which is what, I mean, other than, when you take this out of general ratepayer, the obligation to provide general energy to the marketplace stuff, you're taking it out and now you're going to silo it to yourself, essentially remove yourself from the market. But if you're siloing yourself from the governmental regulation, that's the whole idea of a lot of these things, privatization, is to remove it from the governmental. So you then overlay another layer of governmental regulation, just the purpose of removal. So I just don't see the purpose of having, if the government wants to be involved in these transactions, once they've agreed that they don't, once they agree that the need for microgrids there, to then put them back in at the bottom line to actually manage responsibility doesn't make a ton of sense, other than the general oversight to make sure that you're doing other construction that it's actually done in a proper form process. After that, get out.
So that construct is of two extremes there. We'll rarely see these, I think, full government ownership versus full private, because you're dealing with government, and the government has some responsibilities in what it's dealing with here.
But the governmental investment here is investment to actually solidify or create resiliency within the overall structure. And that's, if you don't have a single purpose from the governmental side as to why you're doing this, then you're never going to get it done. Because you need a single purpose to make this happen. You need an overarching reason. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this finding? What are we trying to accomplish in this process? If we don't have a goal of what we're trying to accomplish in the process, it doesn't work.
I think I absolutely agree with that point, that you've got to have a purpose for it.
What is the purpose?
Well, that's the question. I asked that earlier.
But that should be framed before you even start the question. That should be number one. The rest of this doesn't make any sense until you frame the purpose.
The purpose is resilience.
Well, if that's the purpose, then it's going to have to, if that purpose is resiliency, then the idea of resiliency is that you either say, we're better at it from a governmental perspective, we're better at it from a private sector perspective. And if you choose the private sector perspective, if they're better at doing it than the public sector perspective, then you can move yourself out from the governmental regulatory side and let the private sector take it over.
So, but you're still dealing with the monopoly in those cases. So you've got government concern about public and what cost is being paid for that. What's the price being paid for that?
That deals with general distributed electricity, which is not what microgrids do.
Or at least who those people on the grid, what are they paying for? The government is investing that. Is it resiliency at any price?
That's just going to have to be done under Sandy.
Well, where's I'm into that, but we've got the notions of our energy strong programs, where we're spending $1 billion to harden the system. If we keep using Sandy as the benchmark for how we measure and determine whether something is resilient or not, we're doing it wrong, because we're making a whole lot of investment to harden that stuff.
I think a lot of people feel that way, but the caveat is that there are impartial arm's length free markets driving it, not asymmetric, And if you look at, just to throw out a different industry class example, California is now proposing to get in and manufacture generic pharmaceuticals because it's so tilted and corrupted so the free market doesn't exist. I'm not saying that about the utilities here, but the fact is, if it was truly a market-driven thing, somebody would value and pay for resilience because there's a price, there's a market price for that. We don't have that. So a little bit of a caveat to your point, but well taken.
Anybody else on this? It's a good one.
So I guess I point you maybe to the new P3 law that just passed unanimously.
That was pocket vetoed by the governor and won't take effect, that one?
We don't know yet.
No, you know, the governor had to sign it already if that was the case.
He's still got a few days. Don't be so quick.
I don't think so, but go ahead.
So it was, yeah.
Maybe until Tuesday, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you're hoping, okay.
So the language in there could certainly be leveraged here. So specifically the P3 units that very much addresses this kind of asymmetrical balance of information so that there is somebody that the municipality or the local government entity or whomever can kind of go to as an independent arbiter with this specifically on it. Nobody in government circles, and it's not that they're not smart, it's that they have so many other things to deal with. So
That's a little condescending, but go ahead.
You said
Go ahead.
no, and I've heard you talk about this before, Mark. So
Yeah.
I think I'm back to, I don't think you're in disagreement here where you also said that, doing this at the government level, there's some support necessary, technical support. This is very advanced technical stuff. So maybe that's part of the process. It's certainly related to this issue. It's sort of central to this particular issue, and this is a major issue.
Yeah.
So again, I've pocket vetoed or not, the language is good.
I will tell you, I have some significant concerns with that, and let me clarify this. Not part of this project. From my other world that I live in of dealing with government procurement issues, where I've been involved in legislation, I see some serious problems with that particular piece of legislation. I personally hope it gets pocket vetoed. I think there's some better ways of getting there, and look forward to hopefully helping with it.
So just to
Yes.
talk about the two, the history is really a public purpose microgrid, and I think what the team members did really well was defining the scope of what a public purpose microgrid is, so drilling down resiliency.
Yeah.
So I think a recommendation is if you can include historically, how did we get here? What is critical? What's a FEMA class 1, 2, 3, 4, the tiers?
That's the planning
And
side of
then
things.
That's where we had to include government at the table because FEMA tier 4 is defense agencies, it's municipal facilities, police, town, fire, and then we went down to tier 1, and that could be maybe private entities. So that would be my recommendation, is kind of drilling down what
Yeah.
that public purpose was from how we got here.
Dean?
Just following up on this, if you know what you want in terms of the risk appetites and everything else, the microgrid, without do it. I think the first part of that conversation is what we're really focusing on. How do you know what you want as a municipality? And most of the asymmetry of information that you're talking about comes in that process, defining the problem. And so how do we, one of the things we're trying to get at in this study is what do you do to change that asymmetry a little bit in the problem definition, in terms of how you're procuring and what you're doing. So I think because otherwise you pre-abandon it.
It strikes me that that process up front is absolutely essential to be done thoroughly and carefully to identify everything that's out there as part of a setup for this. I will, yes. Okay.
Just doing my job.
It's okay. Thank
Mark,
you.
can I ask
Yeah.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So I'm curious what you mean by the government should set this up. Can you clarify that?
My perspective, either the private sector or an efficient way of approaching a project and really governmental. And once you make a decision that you need the project constructed, right, that's the first frame of the project. After that, the rest of the process, as far as financing, that all into the developer side. That becomes developer-driven concern.
more than fundamental governmental concerns.
So the only reason why I asked that question is because we have, from experience, when Hoboken negotiated its contract for its water utility, we did that. What occurred was that over time, revenue and profit from the water utility system was not reinvested in operations and maintenance, and we began encumbering capital expenses on an emergency basis to provide an essential service. And this is different, but what I'm saying is that the purpose of our oversight within this, whether we're building a new utility or you're creating a new argument for a rate case or you're providing simply energy as a service, we are protecting the interests and public safety. So I would say that there's not a point in time where, as a local government, we should necessarily.
So that's the contractual relationship. The issue you have there, and it's the same time, to do a lot of times, governmental function. So the issue you have there is that the contract itself, actually turned over the operations to private entity, didn't have contractual safeguards that provide that they had to actually provide for certain reserves and certain capital requirements, right? That's a contractual drafting error more than an actual issue. Because you knew the issue was there, so contractually covered it. So, a lot of these
The point is that 20 years down the road, anyways, I get your point, but I think that there's a lot of this point specifically.
Yeah, I just want to do one thing. I want to, we got Kalo is here from Hoboken, and I don't know.
David wants to March.
They want to March. But so I don't want to dwell on this one too much longer, but I think there's a really interesting thing here. Why are municipalities involved in this anyway? Right? What's the answer to that question?
Well, I think that municipalities are involved because if it's ever going to happen, you have to have municipalities buy in from the beginning. If this is completely done by the private sector as a private enterprise, and everyone who wants to create a microgrid facility has to acquire a piece of land, go before a local municipality for their board approvals, they'll never happen because everyone will become a big fight. Everyone will become not in my backyard. Unless the municipalities are involved from the beginning in partnering with either providing land, providing space to create facilities, and not having to go through that process, then 20 years from now, we'll be having the same conversation, nothing will be built.
Am I wrong to think that part of this problem is a failure of the utility regulatory system? That the public utility system and the electric distribution organizations, that they should have had, that they had a job, or maybe we didn't demand enough out of that system to ensure reliability where we have these types of events. For several generations, we accepted power outages when there are hurricanes. Now, with climate change, we're seeing a lot more frequency, right, and a lot more risk being faced. But should we be looking at the utility companies? And clearly, we just did because we just put $1 billion into that in JCP in PSE&G area alone.
So I think you're asking for way too much from the utilities as time has gone on.
Well, yeah, because we're in this business now. Yes.
Two aspects to it. So first of all, our dependence on pure electricity has grown incredibly. So we're at 5 nines is no longer enough, even for your home. God forbid your home theater system goes down. So
Damn Netflix, yeah.
We're asking more of the utilities than they were ever asked to do. So, and there was a very interesting commentary from RAP a couple of years ago that said, with this utility system that we have, there's no way in hell we can fix the entire distribution transmission system. If it's resiliency you're after, then fix it at the point of use. I mean, that is the only thing that's feasible. And I think that's what happens.
And that's what now we have government in, because we're dealing with government right of way, dealing with government facilities, all right? To a lesser extent, it's public facilities, it's government facilities, and there's a responsibility there. Joe?
There's a big piece in here. You have to really differentiate between resilience and reliability. Utilities are tasked with reliability, not resilience. Resilience is almost defined as an extremely low frequency, highly improbable event of very short duration,
Right.
compared to reliability. Reliability is 87, 60 hours a year. How many of them are you available? Are we meeting an acceptable standard? And you can't expect utilities, and I've been critical of them, but I also work with them and for them. And the fact is, you can't expect them to deliver results that they were never asked to, never tasked to, that their technology and their system isn't designed for. So if I'm looking at a very low frequency event and I want resilience, the place where that has to occur is where the load is. The utility system is managed as a source to load, not at load. So we are looking at very different things. One comment about your asymmetrical information issue, we have some great examples of where local governments and various people have been shafted royally because they didn't know what they were getting into in contracts.
I'm shocked.
And solar PPAs, one of my favorite things in the whole world.
Yes, and we
2% escalation, 4% escalation.
and we've seen it with ESIPs as well.
15 years ago, 20 years ago, somebody said to the local government, your electric rate's gone up 2.5% a year every year. Let's bake that in for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
Then the electric rate goes down.
Right.
Now you have local governments who are paying more for electricity than the avoided costs coming from the BGS.
Thus,
This is why I think that there is an asymmetric information issue, but there's also a risk-reward information issue. You have to somehow assure yourself when you start talking about these risks that you don't start putting risks on a particular sector, public sector especially, that are not truly their risk. Fuel
Yes.
risk is certainly, to the extent they consume fuel, is a risk they accept and is part of what they do. But risk on conversion efficiencies or avoided costs, they have no control over those.
Thus, the focus that I've been talking about on risk, about information, and clearly it is a touch point here. Let me just make a couple observations on some of the comments that have come in thus far. Some of the people made some suggestions. I'm not going to go over the things we can add in, but just a couple of them. What makes this concept different than any other finance challenge? There are standard questions and challenges, and then a series of questions and challenges specific to a project to create the capital stack. I think that goes back to the thing we were talking about of understanding what those options are. Somebody asked, is this study just about recommendations for government entities or funding microgrids at private entities and consider? The answer is no, it is just government. This is a government advanced microgrid project. And somebody observed that provocatively, the failure is squarely on the shoulders of the utilities and their owners. Clearly, that would definitely has application in California and their wildfire issues, but that going back to where where governmental regulation kind of didn't respond soon enough to the challenges facing utilities, where we still have this tension of returns to investors, rates to ratepayers, reliability built into the system. These are all the challenges that we continue to have. Moving on, some related issues along the way.
What about my question?
I'm going to get to your question at the end. At what point do financing issues and decisions become clear before or after detailed design and technical feasibility? What mechanics are necessary for implementing financing options? Federal and state tax impacts, local state tax exemptions, tax credits, and related financings, and the impact of changing circumstances over time. Joe just picked up on that when he talked about when you build in rate increases in advance on something. Rate changes, potential for stranded investments, market changes, funding replacement costs, and tax policies. We want to look at the assessment on stakeholders, the ratepayers, government agencies, the private sector off-takers, the general public. Figure out what constitutes a successful program, examples of existing and potential finance and existing potential financing models. Those are some of the things we think we need to touch on and at least make people aware that these are things you need to think about along the way. If you see any other issues to add to that, you can text them in, shout them out, or send some later.
Again, it might be part of what you've got there, but carbon policies,
that's actually not listed there. Carbon policy, yes.
Of all of them,
Yep.
that seems to be
That's
the
a
one
good- yeah.
that's most
Yep.
likely to happen on bipartisan.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so the last piece on the finance is revenue analysis and streams. and this has got way too many words in it for the SOPA, but it's evaluate the potential for microgrid revenue streams from participation in transmission level of energy service markets, i.e. the various PJM markets, for aggregated microgrid distributed energy resources and regulation services, as well as ancillary and shared service models with potential for market benefits, i.e. sharing conduit with telecom internet service providers. That's what kind of the mission of this particular element is. We want to think about primary revenues and the sale of power, and are there other things that are revenue that I haven't put down on the list? So what was that? Recs. Oh, Recs, good. Yeah, Recs are good. Ancillary revenues, conduit rental for telecom, cabling, and other purposes, sale of right-of-way use for other purposes, for example, 5G cell sites, and other things that may be hanging out there. This is that part of that asymmetry of information issue. Who's doing what where, and where are the revenue streams for it. I think though we've got an obligation to understand what those are and be able to talk about them, so these people using this stuff going forward have a sense of, hey, here's things we need to think about and questions we need to ask. Oh, one more on there. The impact of and on utility rate and reliability issues. Squaring that whole circle. Microgrid procurement contracting options, are what we otherwise know as project development. Necessary to procure and advance microgrid, the subtask will identify and evaluate the range of design, build, operate, maintain, procurement, and contractual models, contract management, and their advantages and disadvantages in a public environment. One of some things of my experience in dealing with public procurement is that most public agencies do a really horrible job when it comes to contract management. This has to do with building construction or anything complicated. Government agencies routinely fail to invest in overseeing the contractor to make sure they're getting what they're doing what they're supposed to do, and the agency getting what they're supposed to get. So this project will identify procurement practices broken into 3 key elements of microgrid development activities. There are issues related to each element, and the effort will analyze and report on them. Those 3 elements are development, initiation, scope, feasibility, preliminary design, financial analysis, ownership decisions, construction, design, build, and commissioning, operation, daily operation, and maintenance. Suppose part of that should also be long-term care, long-term investment to make sure that the thing will continue to operate down the road.
So just from the governmental side, you're essentially going to be layering in, because they don't have somebody
Yes.
to do it, they're layering in additional expenses that have to incur to over time.
Yes. Yes.
Which I'm assuming you're then going to recommend gets repaid by the developer.
How it's done doesn't matter to me. But yes,
They're not money to do it now, so they're not having money to do it.
I can argue that one all day, because there's been any number of points of failure in public construction because the government entity did not want to invest in oversight of their contract. I've seen buildings fall down because of that.
Question of investments.
Yeah.
There's a different topic.
Yeah, you're not going to get me on that one. And no sympathy here. Well, it's part of the cost of a project. It needs to be on this. It needs to be on the page. It needs to be part of what is calculated. Otherwise, you have the potential adding a whole lot of risk. Anybody else on that one? Take me on with that. Go ahead. Development procurement involves many issues: hiring consultants to analyze results of an RFP process, competitive proposals for the development, qualification of participants and evaluation process, public transparency and integrity, legal engineering and financial advisors to develop or review third-party proposals, development and selection of a project team, including contractors if a full public-private partnership is planned, and the variations of design, build, maintain, and own approaches. They all present different issues and considerations that your government agency and your project team have to figure out.
Is that 3 times that?
No. Construction procurement issues may involve professionals for development of plans and specifications and continued engagement of a pre-selected project team, assessment and management of construction risks, example, bonding and insurance practices, terms of contracts, addressing change orders and modifications. I'm sure in the energy business, there's never any change orders or modifications to plans once they've been started. I know in public construction, that's a big deal, but I'm sure here, not a thing. Project management, responsibility for management and integration of project elements, In terms of renegotiation, as things change, it's also involving dispute resolution. Any observations on that? These are all the hard things that government have to deal with. Operational procurement issues may involve hiring of your operators unless part of that project team. Terms and lengths of contracts and renewal terms and conditions. Assessment of maintenance and replacement costs. Matters related to financial management, human resources, your people, technology, cybersecurity. I don't think we have to underline, or everybody knows that is a thing that we didn't necessarily think about 3 or 4 years ago. And routine operations for maintenance and repair costs. Assessment of risks, and a lot of that becomes an insurance-related thing. Those are the thing about going forward. And I suppose not on here, well, we do have that long-term issue. Are you starting to if the operator's got a 20-year contract and you don't have provisions for renewal and replacement of equipment, all right, and you're getting to year 18 and you're going to do a reprocurement, and the new guy comes in and says, well, you got to replace this thing up front because the guy shouldn't have. The contract you had should have done it but didn't. That's a contract management piece as well. I can again, I can't. The numbers of different places where we've seen things like this happen in the public sector, at least in New Jersey, and I know it's happened in other places, just because nobody pays attention. I've got my contract, great, I can move on. The thing works when it's supposed to, and I'm not going to care anything else about it. We had a horrible situation in Camden a number of years ago when they did a P3 for their water system. They owned it a P3 when they got horribly ripped off on rate increases, 2% rate increases every year, I think for going out 20 years. Really bad public decisions that were made, and I would argue that the oversight process failed, but that wasn't my problem. Related procurement issues. What are the project and contract management approaches and options for each element? What starts a project and determines its scope? Got that planning piece we talked about. Here's more on that. A local planning process may be in response to resilience-related event, at request from a local business or institution, availability of government financial assistance can drive those. Does there need to be a planning or review process to validate the proposal to ensure it maximizes value to the community? I touched on that a little bit earlier. Relationship and balancing industry project development practices with matters of public integrity and transparency. We can't forget that. Risk assessment and management, that's their insurance and legal provisions. And those are the key, some other things that we need to think about with that.
Where would, some municipalities are very good at having strategic planning, sort of energy master plans of their own or development master plans.
Big fan here.
Is that just implied that it's a planning and review process? My basic thing is, in this world we're in now, 20 years is like, might as well be 100 in terms of changing. So not planning for a microgrid that evolves, grows, organically changes. Energy storage is a perfect example. You could build a microgrid now as generation. In 3 years, the cost of energy storage might make it much more efficient to change that and reconfigure. But some towns or entities would have a master plan and a roadmap, and others would be like, we bought it, we built it, just keep the thing spinning for 20 years. Where does that dynamic come in?
I don't know how it's resolved. I'm just saying it needs to be on the table. I think it needs to be on the table as a discussion point that you consciously know you've thought about what you're doing, and your contract reflects that, so everybody knows up front what you've decided to do and have. As far as the question, you guys remember when PCs first came out, personal computers first came out? Some of you may not because you grew up with them. But there was a time where the price of those computer boxes was going down 25% a year with more power every other year. And, well, do I buy the computer now or do I wait a year because it's going to be that much better? My approach to advising governments and other folks on those was, you need the thing now, you decide what you want, you decide how much money you have, and you buy the most computer you can for that sum of money, and you don't look back.
Well, but to extend that analogy, it's a good one, is 3 years later, you could put another 16 gigabytes of RAM memory and a solid state hard drive as a refresh
Right.
upgrade.
If, right, yes, if you knew it was, if you thought it was coming, yeah, if you thought that technology was
Even
here.
beyond that, you'll have to, because of the way a computer runs.
Yeah.
You're not locking in for 20.
Right, and
That's
that's my
right.
point, is like, these should be designed to be flexible and organic, and as opposed to, I'm buying it now, it's gonna operate the same way for 20 years, so we have a maintenance budget to just, change out the gear at year 10.
I think highlighting that element of you have a long-term plan for
Yes,
this.
that's what I'm
Your replacement, regeneration, repowering, whatever that is, needs to reflect that time span and what happens when you're done. Because it's not good, because the odds of it just shutting down are very limited, because you become reliant on that service over time. Policy and regulatory issues. Identify and evaluate the key issues, including legal, risk assessment and mitigation, and external comments, topics like right-of-way and incumbent EDCs, contracting and related policy and regulatory issues that would affect the municipal agency that develops or participates in an advanced microgrid. While focused on New Jersey, we will evaluate contemporary and evolving national issues and themes, like focusing on the benchmark agencies we'll be looking at, legal authority and issues of different ownership and operating approaches, risk assessment and mitigation practices, liability protections, engagement of the incumbent EDCs regarding right-of-way rate regulation, example, standby charges and social equity challenges, technical demands and related distribution system issues. Remember, I talked about this as like a Jersey thing to a significant degree. Technology and matters of contemporary cybersecurity management, construction standards, what code standards are applied and issued. Are they a thing? Who makes the decisions on IEEE and NJ code compliance, or does New Jersey Uniform Construction drive it? I don't know the answers to that, but we're going to need to figure that out, and they may be obvious answers or they won't, but we'll be asking those questions. Should there be some form of state regulatory board approval, oversight findings, or other engagement? Dave from Archer just left, and I'm pretty sure I know what his answer was going to be on that. But what do you do? What's an appropriate place for that? Tony?
Well, getting to the policy, legal, legislative component of this, I think is really critical. For local government officials are going to be excited about this if they think it can happen within some reasonable time frame. If, for example, can none of this happen without legislative changes, or can some of this happen without legislative changes? That's a big question. If little or none of it can happen without legislative changes, there's not much appetite out there for thinking that legislature is going to come together and have a kumbaya moment on microgrids. They don't on anything. So one of my questions is, for this group really, is at what point do we directly engage legislators and maybe invite some to a meeting and say, what do you guys think? Here's a few things that you're going to have to address legislatively in order for this to move forward. It's not going to happen. We're all wasting our time. If it is going to happen, let's get the ball rolling and do it. Without that, local officials are going to be reluctant to be excited about this because they're going to feel like they're wasting their time. They want something they can see is going to happen next year, a year later, a year later.
I agree with you, Tony. There's got to be something that's got a smart, a sustain, something that's measurable, that you're going to have a time frame, achievable process to do this. We talked about it a few minutes earlier when we were talking about the energy P3 bill that is in limbo at the moment. Things remain to be seen on that.
So we've done some some impressive research on this. There's nothing that's stopping any municipality from even building a microgrid right now.
Oh, sure there is.
Well, no, I would say that the things that stop it from happening are the point of coupling of the utility and the distribution of electrons across right of way. We can pretty good. No, I'm saying you can build a microgrid, but you wouldn't be able to operate. You wouldn't be able to finance it to do that. I'm saying like actual construction.
It's got to work. Okay, so little rabbit hole here, because it's not so much this study piece. In New Jersey, we need a solution to that problem. All right, the Energy P3 bill that's on the governor's desk was touted as a way of doing that. My personal view, as a representing Blaustein and not this project, is that bill has some significant flaws to it. We can do better, and I think we will. We can talk later. Right, moving on. Does the level of complexity of these types of projects warrant that other set of eyes from an oversight standpoint? Energy-related regulatory risks and challenges, and that would include utility commissioner, local government oversight agency. It may even, and I realize here from the discussion today, that may also involve some relaxation on the DEP side, because they've got a piece of this stuff as well. I think we can do better. We just need to pay a little more attention to it on the Jersey side. When I look at this nationally, we've got 50 states. They're all pretty diverse. Even within New Jersey, we've got some municipalities who I would have no trouble, as a former regulator, who I would have no trouble trusting and have the confidence that they would do something like this right on their own, between Middletown and Hoboken. Yeah, you guys got your crap together. You know how to manage, you know how to think about this stuff. But other places, I'm not sure I would trust them any further than I could pay for somebody to get reelected. We have our challenges in that area, and I'm sure it's replicated in other states as well.
Oh, did you say DEP? Talking about air permits?
Could be air permits, I don't know, could be water, could be sewer. We've got sewer projects where we've got the Camden County MUA project is one of the TCDER deals. That's a sewer project, moving water as part of their project.
And the transit grid is going through that process right now.
Yeah, and yeah, we were talking about it. So I think there's pieces of it we need to look at, and we're probably not smart enough to see all those pieces right now because we haven't seen all the possibilities. So when we do something, it needs to be sufficiently flexible that we can wrangle all of this together. And then, as I said, that's a sidebar conversation.
Do you or anybody know the role of what Rocky Mountain Institute is going to play? I know they were sort of retained by the state.
Yeah, well, now we're getting into an area. The state energy plan is not.
Is that would be a
I think
oversight like advisory group that squarely is in this space?
It could be.
So they're not really, from my understanding.
Okay.
It can be corrected, Rocky Mountain is really supposed to be developing an integrated energy plan. So what they're looking at is ways that New Jersey as a whole, really from a policy standpoint and from a quote unquote practicality standpoint, can meet the new governor's mandate of 100% renewable by 2050. So they're looking at things more kind of big picture. They're not so much, or at least at this point in time, looking at things more like boots on the ground and smaller aspects. I'm very familiar with the plan, and some of my concerns are how both things mix together, but they do account that there needs to be some sort of aspect of resilience and stuff.
Oh, the scope includes, but yeah, they're at this level.
They're at
we're
this
down.
level, they're not
I think
where we are.
I think there's exploration and there's going to be a range of solutions for that. And I think each state, again, I think we're going to be one at proposing the questions that every organization that wants to look at this needs to answer in their own environment. Okay, moving on here. Okay, this is kind of the last section. We're sort of on time here. So in looking at this, we developed some interesting other questions that are not part of the initial SOPA. And we're kind of trying to figure out whether we do these or not, whether they're necessary, whether we get to go back to DOE to expand the SOPA, and there's other administrative issues along those lines. But I want to throw these out to you guys and get your feedback, again, either now or subsequent to this via email or phone calls, whatever. So here's what, I want to know what you think about some of these things. We've touched on this notion of a plan. And should we or do we need to address the notion of an entity needing to have a plan up front, or do we start with how the agency proceeds once the decision is made and not care how they got there? What are those implications? Remember, we said procurement and financing was the original framework of this. Well, do we care about how they got to the procurement process? Because that affects the procurement process. So do you think about what local needs, what's that local need to be filled? We talked about that earlier. There seemed to be some interest, some enthusiasm for that notion. An exploration or review of the alternatives to meet the need. Legal authority issues dealing with the EDC, statutes, liability risk management, IRS tax issues and partnerships. Financial viability via pro forma or other resource. Environmental permitting viability, risk assessment, mitigation and management, public support and local stakeholder engagement. I know from the conferences that we've been to on microgrids across the country, engaging local stakeholders is a big deal. Not just a government agency doing this, let's do this on our own and we'll talk to people later, but engaging your stakeholders involved seems to be a big thing when you look at this nationally. Technical viability, including a cybersecurity assessment, utility interface standards and design issues. If you're gonna, what's that code issue that we keep hearing about? Role of an oversight agency, short versus long-term focus that leads to future issues such as sale, maintenance, and support. Great, I'm gonna contract with a third party. They're gonna do do a DBOM for me, design, build, own, and manage thing. And 5 years after it's up, they decide to sell. All right, and all of a sudden I have a different set of players and organizations that I'm dealing with that may not have the integrity of that organization that I grew accustomed to in the beginning. What happens then? All right, what were the unanticipated circumstances that resulted because of an asymmetric knowledge of information that my developer had planned to do that all along perhaps and built that contract to have provisions that favors them over the public side of things. Think about that kind of stuff. The plan could lead to or incorporate the start of the procurement process. So that's a thing. And whether we deal with this or not is still an open question. And I'm curious about feedback. Should we go in this direction or?
Well, I mean, I don't know how you can. I mean, I think the second phase of the PQ's program could be precisely what you have up there. Forget about engineering, bids, spec documents.
Okay.
This is what you should have.
This question gets back to what if we had done this work for the 10 years leading up to Sandy, how would the city have spent its money if there was appropriate projects to fund through Sandy recovery instead of standalone natural hazard.
But now that we know it's a thing, what do we do now? What do we do going forward? So comments on that would be most appreciated. Two related questions for that. Should the value of public benefits evaluation assessment be part of planning a microgrid? Emergency resiliency issues, decarbonizing, cost saving, support of community resources, community economic development, social environmental justice issues. Does this study need to think about that other than in the implications it may have for financing of federal tax impacts? So the other one is, does a project have to save money? If so, does the value of resiliency come into play? If so, can it be calculated? Maybe a review of thinking or ideas around it or what's been happening in the benchmark places helps to inform that. IOUs and EDCs, unfortunately, my friends from PS just left, and Jersey Central, I think, also left. But understanding the impact that microgrids have on investor-owned utilities, this is a whole big list of things here. We need to understand the impact on the operating issues that will enable procurement. To what extent should an IOU be involved in a microgrid? Questions apply to the role of the agency, ownership, operation, capacity to run it. Difference between IOUs that can own generation versus those that don't. And those that have deregulated parents. We're talking about you, PSEG. Should EDCs be given the authority to lead agencies, allowed to participate with them as necessary? Impact on third-party investors compromised by this, and is that an issue to care about? And do variations of different states make this impractical to study? Would it be a rate-based issue, potential microgrid ownership, and rate-based and standby fees allowed to address the cost of managing DER? If a utility is going to wind up doing there's been some discussions of this already. Utilities that are going to go into the business of running DERs or managing DERs that hang off their network, right, off their distribution grid, should they be compensated for that is a question that's being raised. And they talk about distributed energy resource management systems and investments in those. Those are some bigger issue questions that go beyond microgrids. touch all other kinds of things.
Something that you have missing in here, though, is that you also have municipal utilities and rural electric co-ops. That
Yes.
also are part of the system, and are they a good model, a bad model, or how do they interact with these other questions?
We do have, there's a separate piece of this that we didn't bring out today about the resources people we're gonna talk to, in addition to stakeholders in our advisory group. I've got the New Jersey Public Power Authority on that as well, which is our 12 or 11 independent municipal electric utilities that were all formed in the late 40s and early 50s. They are the only people who actually have the statutory authority as a municipality to be in the electrical distribution business.
And if you look at what's going on in California, several of the major cities are looking to buy the assets from the
Yes.
utility and say, get the hell off our backs,
Right.
let us manage this locally.
Yeah, that's not going to be a good idea. And I also have, engineering technical approval issues and the microgrid tariffs of some utilities. That's more of a national piece than here. Assessment of microgrid technologies. Does our report need to address the various microgrid tech in some way and their related risks, or would this be resolved in some form of risk assessment as part of a plan or a contract, and dealing with some of the primary technologies that are out there, at least the source of energy? We also clearly understand that there's a whole challenge of management of a microgrid, how those decisions are made, the technology that goes behind that when you're turning on, when you're on the grid, when you're off the grid, maintaining the system. All of that stuff becomes part of this. Raising that question, I'm not terribly convinced that's a good idea right now, and input on that would be lovely. And look, it's 2 minutes of 2.
Wow. Perfect.
Whew. All right, what do we got left? Do I have any more things? So we have 2 other comments here. What do we call grants to towns to supplement development of TCDERs? A model scope of work and schedule of deliverables. I'm not quite sure I understand that. We have an interest in New Jersey, but we've seen in other states where they provide money. Isabel made it very clear in her presentation that all of the microgrids Connecticut was looking at needed some form of third-party financing or subsidy to make work, be it reduce interest rate costs or low-cost investors, or direct grants to reduce the cost. She was saying that these do not stand on their own. They do not, the ones they've been looking at do not stand on their own. And a comment that a plan seems central to evaluating governance and hidden risk is inherent without it. Anybody else? I thank you all for hanging out to the very bitter end here.
Do you think there's any chance that you would have a network of microgrids somehow associated across some region? Like say Monmouth Ocean and Road.
That work together collaboratively?
Somehow.
Yeah, I mean, definitely in higher ed, they do that a lot, and there's large energy users group. I think it's very supportive, and I think it's necessary for users.
I think the definition of network here becomes important.
Right.
If I'm talking about a group of users who collaborate on what they do together, yeah, that's easy.
I mean, they might have
If you're talking of interconnection network, that could be interesting and challenging. I immediately go thinking about the legal structure for that. It would, one of the things we ought to do at some, putting on my Jersey hat here, my Boston hat here, is deal with the very antiquated municipal utility statutes. All right, we probably ought to look at that in saying, well, if a municipality is going to develop some microgrids for whatever purpose, and there could be, and we know just among the TCDPR guys, there's 12 different variations on the theme there, right? That maybe that structure for municipalities is a utility operation that allows them to bill and collect revenues and be self-sufficient in how that operates. And that may be a structure, doesn't have to be the full municipality, it's be parts of it. That may be an approach. And then you get to a point where could you have a regional one of those that is operating several of those? Yeah, you could do that. And that, I think, goes to what you're talking about.
Delaware DMAP is an association of the 9 municipal electric utilities in Delaware, and they do a lot of things jointly. They even went jointly to the extent of going out of state and investing in a large combustion turbine power plant which provides power through the grid to all of them as a shared cost. So there's an example of each one of those essentially is a microgrid and a management service area, and then they collectively got together to negotiate for supply.
Well, that's what our public power authority. Yeah, our little public power authority of those communities that have electric utilities banded together so they could actually go out and buy supply and invest in a supply someplace. I'm not sure that actually happened, but that was one of their
They never invest
their ideas.
They only buy energy supply as in most cases they do individuals.
Yeah, one of the ideas is that they'd be able to aggregate and invest in a plant someplace, and that was a sticking point along the way.
So the concept I think that Dennis is alluding to in our Middletown study, we had recommended ultimately, because ours I think was of all the 12 were the most far-flung geographically.
Yeah.
Cross right-of-ways is a lot of it. But the idea would be that a microgrid form that would be economically logical, be driven to its optimal generation mix, but it could grow so that one of the microgrids in that network might be the storage space. That they make investment for storage that sells as a service to other microgrids. But obviously the piece there is that, in our case, JCP&L would need to be allowed to connect those microgrids, have a specific, and what we proposed was forming a regulatory sandbox to evaluate how that service could be.
So that notion of regulatory sandboxes I think has some validity to it. I think it could be part of the solution. I think this notion of letting municipalities go into the utility business for electrical distribution and supply, I think there's something to that. We would need to change those old statutes. That's the challenge. But I think
the idea of the sandbox would be let's generate some real data.
Yes.
What the impacts are with the safety of any, let's look at how it's playing out.
There's some approaches to that, I think, that have validity, but again, they may touch this particular project, but that's a specific Jersey thing, and I want to get out of that rabbit hole.
There's a concept of microgrid clusters that's been around for a while now, where they're all, you have one, even.
But we got campus ones.
In our Montclair study, we looked at, we have specifically serving 8 facilities in one microgrid, but you could very easily go from Montclair State and Little Falls all the way down to Bloomfield and pick up probably 7 or 8 other.
And those become, and that,
along the rail line.
but that sets up a whole bunch of really interesting challenges and questions along the way, and that go to equity and who gets access to it, and they're really icky questions there. I think then
That's what makes it fun.
Interesting topics.
I think then we are done. On behalf of the project team and the BPU, I want to thank you all for sticking it out and hanging out here today. We're probably going to do this again in like April timeframe, Tara?
April, or I guess maybe end of April.
End of April. So we'll have a new show with some new entertainment. Yeah, we'll do something else. We hope you found this useful. Please follow up with us with any comments. Please, drop me a note for any of the things that you see about the study that we ought to look at. It's clearly a daunting project. The challenge is how we wrangle all this and get it done in a year.
I had a tentative schedule and sent it out.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, I have one other question that came up here. Was what is your gripe with carbon bikes? I think I mentioned I'm going to Australia. I'm going to a trip next month. I'm going to be cycling. I'm going to be cycling in New Zealand and in New Zealand doing a bike trip there. And my gripe with carbon bikes is that I tend to fall down and crack things. So I'm a titanium guy. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Have a great rest of the winter, and we'll see you again in the spring. And I may be in touch with some of you along the way come March and April. And if anybody wants to hang around and talk, I'm more than happy to do that. Well done. Master some BPS.
Yes. Hey, Mark, I'm going to send you this question. It's a generic one you've never looked at. The IRS rules allow us on distribution systems, district energy, salt water, hot water pipes, just as distribution systems, defining those with tax exempt funds.
Okay.
We've never explored the ability to include electricity as a distribution system.
Is that is part of, wasn't that part of Veolia and Trenton?
There'll be a question with them eventually, but this is just a general issue. No one's ever asked the question I know of, or tried to propose using the same exemption, or the same empowerment of using tax exempt funds for district energy distribution as a source of funding for microgrids.
Yes, that sounds like the Veolia project a lot, but it is broader. It is broader.
It's a more generic question.
We have not in New Jersey looked at this whole idea of other public entities going into this type of business is new and different. And employing and how they go about employing the right of way.